In 2010, I was trying to understand the European sovereign debt crisis for myself, and Nigel Farage was the person who could explain it to me. Every week he'd jump up in the European Parliament and tell the people who least wanted to hear it why the euro was causing all of the problems that they were having trouble dealing with. The thing is, Nigel was not the only person who helped me understand what was going on back then. The other person who really helped me get a grip of the European sovereign debt crisis and how the euro was behind it is Philip Baggas. And so we've decided to interview him for this edition of Fortune and Freedom and to ask him about his book, which was published in 2010, which is called Tragedy of the Euro. Philip, thanks for joining us. Let's start with the obvious, the title of your book, which is incredibly brilliant in all sorts of different ways. The title could not have been better. So let's explain why that's the case. Let's look into what the tragedy of the commons is, and then we'll look into how that applies to the euro.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for having me. Okay, yeah, the title is because the euro is a tragedy of the commons. It's not only tragic, the euro, in the sense of a drama, but it's a tragedy of the commons. So what is a tragedy of the commons? A tragedy of the commons is when one resource can be exploited by several actors, by several individuals. And a typical example is schools of fish in the ocean. So they are not the property of anyone. So anyone can fish these fish. And the incentive, of course, is to fish as fast and as much as you can, because if I as a fisher don't do it, the other guy will come. Yeah, and maybe if the school of fish would be only mine, I would take care of it. If there's a small fish, I would actually return it to the sea again. But if the other fish is right behind me, I will also take the small fish so that it cannot grow and reproduce. So the result then is an overexploitation of the resource. Yeah, all fish are fast as they can, because otherwise the other fishers would fish the fish. So there's an overexploitation of the resource, which would not happen if it would be privately owned, because then the capital value of the resource would belong to one person, and that is the future income stream. It would be also taken into account. So with the tragedy of the commons, to solve it, one way is to privatize it, obviously. And what governments normally do or often do is to impose quotas. So every fisher can fish so many fish per year so that there's no overexploitation and it can reproduce. So why do I say the euro is kind to this? Well, we have one printing press basically in the Eurozone that can be used by several different governments. Yeah, that can use one printing press to exploit a commonly owned resource, which in this case is the purchasing power of the euro. And how is it done? Well, let's say the Greek government wants to win elections and proposes increases in the state pensions. So how do they finance it? Well, they normally don't finance it with tax increases because they're unpopular and they show the costs of the government goodies very clearly. So they prefer to finance it to government debts. So the Greek government just issues paper and they put on the paper government bonds. And then the banking system may buy these bonds, yeah, and pledge these bonds as collateral at the European Central Bank, receiving new reserves with the ECB, so fresh euros. So fresh euros are created, given to the banks, that in turn gives the government bonds to the ECB. This is like an indirect financing of the government. Governments today, it's more direct because ECB has started to purchase government bonds directly. This was not thought like this or supposed to be like this. Is actually it's prohibited, but they don't care for contracts. But in any way, it's quite similar. The ECB can just buy the government bonds directly, or it goes through the banks, buy the bonds and pledges it as collateral by the ECB. The effect is the same. The money supply increases. So the result of the Greek government deficit is that the money supply increases and prices tend to go up. But not only in Greece, but also all over the Eurozone, because when prices start to go up in Greece, the Greeks will start to buy stuff from the other countries where prices are still lower. So the purchasing power of the euro falls in all countries, which means for the Greek politician that he can externalize the costs of the government deficit and the promises he made to win the elections. He can externalize it to foreigners. Yeah, that is Italians, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Germans pay part of the cost of the Greek deficit in form of higher prices or fall in the purchasing power of the euro. So that is the analogy to the fishing, yeah, exploiting the commonly owned resource, the purchasing power. But and like the fishers, there's not only one fisher, or like in the US where there's only one government, one federal government. But here we have several governments. So the Italian politicians have the same incentives like the Greeks or the Spanish or the Germans. Yeah, only internal political reasons or norms or traditions can hold them back. Yeah, so the incentive is to have actually higher deficits than others. And let me explain you to this, because this is even more extreme than with the fishers. Because let's imagine that the German government has a deficit of 3% of GDP, which is the Stability and Growth Pact limit, and issues government bonds, German government bonds. They are bought by a large part of them are bought by the German banking system, pledged as collateral at the ECB, and the money supply increases. And all the rest of the Eurozone together has, on average, a deficit of 10% of GDP. It's also monetized. And let's say then, on average, prices rise 8% in the Eurozone as a consequence. That means that the German government, even though it has a deficit of 3%, its real government spending may actually fall, because prices rise 8% with the deficit of only 3%. So you see, you can only win in this redistribution again if you have actually a higher deficit than the others. That is, you can only win if you fish more fish than the others. So this is obviously a totally self-destructing setup with the incentives. And the question is actually, was it possible for this to survive? And the answer is that the governments cannot directly print the euros, but they have to go through the banking system and through the ECB, that the ECB must be willing to monetize these debts, and it may not be willing to do so. And it may be also, and there has been the rules instituted, which say, well, we put in the quotas, like with the fish, you own a certain amount of tons of fish. Here the quota is the 3% of the Stability and Growth Pact. Actually, this was made even harsher in the fiscal compact later in 2012. Anyway, but it's not that a government imposes on fishers, you have only so many quotas, and if you don't, you go to prison. It's more like a voluntary agreement among the fishers. Okay, let's have only so many tons of fish, because more than 100 times governments have had higher deficits, and there has been no consequence whatsoever. There has been no penalties. No one has been kicked out of the euro. There has been the intent to limit the tragedy of the commons has failed. It has failed, and the only thing that has limited it was, well, that the fear that if you overdo it, then someone, for example, Germany, would just leave the euro. So in this sense, be careful not overdoing it. But the incentive is, of course, to exploit the commons. So the strategy of the euro is still intact. And as I say in the book, or said 10 years ago, there are 3 ways to solve it, or for solutions to it. One is to really strictly impose these limits, to say 3% deficit, the exploitation of the commons, or maybe 0 should be optimal or even better. But this would require that the structural deficits that many governments would have to be eliminated. And this would mean that they cannot finance us with debts anymore, and their welfare states. And this would require strict reforms, harsh reforms, of labor markets and of government spending. and the population would have to support it and not go on streets and riot. So the question here is if the populations are not socialistic, or are not too socialistic to permit these reforms to happening. And we have seen in the last 10 years in some countries with a very strong pressure reforms in this direction. In Greece, actually, in Portugal, in Spain, in Italy, even in Italy a little bit. However, these reforms all ended then when Draghi uttered his words, whatever it takes, we will do whatever it takes. So then all the pressure to do the reforms were actually was gone, and the reforms halted. So this is the first options to do reforms and austerity and harsh limits with penalties on deficits. The second one is that someone gets out of the euro, that this whole thing breaks up. It could be or that Germany leaves, or someone who wants a sounder currency leaves, or someone is actually kicked out. And Greece in 2015 was actually very close to be kicked out. Yeah, they at last they agreed to the reforms that they were supposed to do, at least on paper. But first, the government, the Tsipras government, they said, no, we are not doing the reforms. We actually will do a referendum to get population for our confrontational course. And they got the confrontation. But then the ECB said, okay, that now we will stop you the finance. And then they had to do the bank holidays, and they had basically a collapsed banking financial system. And then they said, okay, even though the population actually voted for us to do the confrontation, of course, we know we'll do the austerity. So these two options, they existed. Or Germany, for example, says enough is enough and we leave, or someone is kicked out or leaves. And the third option is, of course, that we continue with this inflation and we get actually a strong central state. So that's someone controls and harmonizes the deficits, but this will be on an ever higher level. Yeah, in the same way they do it with taxes. They want to harmonize taxes, and then once we get rid of the competition between the countries, yeah, then there will be run for higher taxes and higher deficits, and we will get a strong European super state. And we have seen many steps in this direction also in the last 10 years. Now we get the EU budget financed through loans in the Corona crisis. But even before, we had proposal to have an economic government in the EU and a finance minister, and the issuance of bonds, commonly common bonds, European bonds that are guaranteed by all members. So there are strong pressures in this direction, and we have to see how it ends. Because the tragedy of the euro would end if we would have one strong government, central government, who would impose deficits on all, like in the United States. We would have a central state. So this is a way out, not a way out that I would prefer, but it's a way out.
That was focusing on the monetary policy angle and how the tragedy of the commons plays out through the ECB. There's also the argument that it applies through the bailout policy, whether Germany will rescue anyone who gets into financial trouble. This has a very similar effect, correct?
Yes, actually it made the redistribution more obvious, or it makes the redistribution more obvious, because before 2010, when the Greek government had deficits and lower interest rates than they could have had alone, where they would stand alone without the implicit guarantee or bailout guarantee of Germany, they were implicitly bailed out. And if they had higher deficits than Germany, they would get a net inflow of goods. Yeah, because they would produce more money and buy goods from Germany. Now, if Germany gives a loan to Greece, and the Greeks then buy goods from Germany, it's the same effect. But of course, it's more obvious. It makes the redistribution more obvious. The monetary redistribution, most people don't understand. Yeah, they don't understand how the government bonds are pledged as collateral, but it has the same effect. The Greek government has more funds, and they spend it, and the people then buy goods and services, for example, from Germany. then the deficit went higher and higher, and financial markets did not trust that this would hold on anymore. So interest rates went up, and then they had actually to explicitly bail out Greece. But then you give also funds to Greek, and they buy goods and services. So this is financing their trade deficit, has been financing their trade deficit, which is the result of this redistribution.
The time you wrote the book, we got remarkably close to default, as you say, and I think your book summed it up really well by pointing out that the credit default swap risk was even higher than during the Lehman Brothers crisis at one point. And also, you wrote that the monthly bulletin of the ECB in June of 2010 acknowledged just how close we got. So I think the viewers need to realize that if there is something inherently wrong with the euro, and the 2010 crisis suggested that default really is a genuine possibility. Do you think that's still true?
Yes, of course. And we were not only close in June 2010, we were then again very close in June 2012, which forced Draghi to say something which is actually totally against the treaties, to pay whatever to produce. He basically pledged to produce any money necessary to save the euro, which is not the objective or the principles of the ECB. Yeah, and then the default, especially with this very, very high debt after the corona, it's still going on. I mean, these are incredible high debts in Spain, in France, in Italy, in Greece. So what are the way outs? Well, the way outs is financial repression, high inflation, and if they don't want this high inflation, then they're very, very likely there can be defaults. Yeah, there are defaults, and and the banking system is also loaded up with government bonds. So then the banking system would also collapse. So I don't know if they would let that happen. I suppose they rather will print money. But of course, the default option.
Yeah, that's my conclusion too. You mentioned the constraints that were put in place to try and make the euro work. It wasn't always as flawed as it appears now. Can you take us through the history of how the euro came to be and how it was designed to actually work a lot better than it has worked so far?
We had this intent to install a common currency for a long time. It started in the 1970s, actually, but nothing went concrete. And in the 1980s, there were other intents to install it. But of course, the German population was very much against it because they had the D-Mark and they were very proud of it. And they thought, well, if we go together with the Italians and Greeks, this is very dangerous. So actually, the project went really ahead in the wake of the German reunification, when actually, and their documents are now official, that actually François Mitterrand, the French president, he asked, in order to give his permission to the German reunification, he said, we have to install the euro. Actually, he said, if we don't march forward with European unification, meaning the euro, a common currency, if we don't do it right now, we will have a situation like in 1913. 1913 is, as you know, 1 year before the First World War, and Germany was isolated, and had two front war. And we had this twice in the 20th century, and it did not work out so very well. So this was quite a threat, to be isolated. So what do you do? Or what did Helmut Kohl do? He said, yes, let's go forward with the European integration and start the common currency. And then in Maastricht, it was then done. And of course, the Germans were very, they had to, well, they actually did not ask the German population, but they put in safeguards, as you said. And this was first the Stability and Growth Pact, who said we have to, and also the criterion to access the euro, that you have to have low inflations, government debts lower than 60% of GDP, and deficits up to 3%. Yeah, but then again, these rules are not adhered to. Today, almost all countries have higher than 60% of GDP debt. Yeah, and they have all higher than 3% deficit. Yeah, at the end, governments don't care for the contracts they sign. Yeah, and in fact, in 2012, when the European Stability Mechanism was installed, yeah, in the beginning, 2010, they installed a temporary bailout fund to bail out countries that would need funds. Yeah, temporary. Yeah. So, and then they wanted to make it, permanent. And Germany said, no, we don't want it permanent because then some countries may just have higher deficits and we have to bail them out. We don't want that. If we say yes to the European Stability Mechanism, we want to reform the Stability and Growth Pact with the Fiscal Compact. And this was a deal. The Fiscal Compact was agreed upon in 2012, and Germany agreed to the permanent bailout fund, the European Stability Mechanism. So what does the Fiscal Compact actually say? It says that, because the problem of the Stability and Growth Pact was that countries interpreted it as if they could have 3% deficit, yeah, and they had 3% deficit in good times. And when a recession came, they said, oh, now it's extraordinary times, now we need 6 or 7%. So the Fiscal Compact says you should have basically a balanced budget, a structurally balanced budget, which means that over the business cycle, it should be structured. So in good times, you should actually have a surplus, and in bad times, you can go up to 3%. Yeah, so only in bad times in the recession. And it says you actually, if your debt to GDP ratio is below 60%, yeah, you can have like a 1% deficit, and if it's over it, you can have a 0.5, so basically a balanced. And it says also a very important and actually good thing. It says that if your debt to GDP ratio is higher than 60%, you have to reduce it every year by 20%. Yeah. So if, for example, you're indebted 100%, like by 5%, you have to reduce by 5%. So if you're indebted like France or Spain, like 100%, so you're 40% over the 60, so you have to reduce 5% of it. So you should have a surplus of 2% every year until you get back to the 60%. Yeah. So from 2012 on, all these countries should have had a surplus actually of 2% to go back down to the 60%. But of course they did not. And it was actually good times. I mean, in Spain, we had several years of 3% growth. So actually you should have had surpluses if you would follow the spirit of the contract, if you wanted from the very beginning, actually. Now, if you just pretended to do something that you never wanted actually to do. And even though we had growth of 3% in Spain, there were deficits of actually more than 3%. So it is totally ridiculous what they are doing. I mean, so the limits for the strategy of the euro that were in place and are in place, they actually don't care because it's political decisions. Yeah.
Do you believe that they will ever matter, that those constraints will ever matter, or was it foolish to believe that anyone would abide by them?
Yeah, I think it was totally foolish to believe that politicians would follow them. I mean, there's no one who actually would punish them if they would not do so. So there's no sanctions, and they are colluding with each other. Yeah, they are colluding. They are the ruling class, and they benefit from it. And of course, also the banking system. You have to take into account that if one of country collapses or defaults, then these are huge problems for the European banking system as a whole. And there's a huge lobby to keep the game going.
There's a particular part of your book that's a bit of a tangent, but I think it'll fascinate a lot of the viewers, a lot of them are Brexiteers, Brexit voters, supporters of Nigel Farage. And you argue, in fact, you almost persuaded me that the EU was a good idea. And you say that because there's two very different visions for what the EU is. You've got the classical liberal one, which is actually the right sort of thing to do, and the socialist one. And what the EU's done, the creation of the EU has done, is create this huge power structure that can go either way. It can create lots of freedoms, or it can go down a socialist path. So can you explain to the listeners how actually the EU might not be as bad as they think it is when it's sort of conducted properly?
Yeah, there, as I say, as you say, there are two visions about how a European Union should look like, and one is the classical liberal one or the libertarian one. Actually, the founding fathers, Adenauer, Alcide Gaspari, Schuman, were still more inclined to this because they understood that we want free trade to have peace in Europe. After the Second World War, they wanted peace, and they understood that free trade was a way towards it. And they were all also Christians, and they know that private property, individual liberty are important values. Actually, the most European values, or what made actually Europe great and the leading continent of this planet. And they were more in this tradition. But then there's also the socialist tradition who wants to make Europe an empire again. They have several intents to unite Europe in an empire, like Charles the Great, Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin. They all wanted to create a huge centralized European empire with the military means. And now they want to use this political means. And actually, French politicians, I argue, they were like very socialist tended. They are socialist tended, and after the trauma of the Second World War and the loss of its overseas colonies, they wanted to have a new empire in Europe, controlled basically by France, and also to get control of Germany, who was defeated. And they, like after the First World War, there was the fear that they would try to get their territories back and their power back in Europe. So the idea was to create a central institution which also would control then Germany, and basically France and its allies would have control of it. So the socialist vision is this: to see Europe like a fortress that is interventionist to the inside and protectionist to the outside. And these visions have been in a constant fight. And the Treaty of Rome, which guarantees the four basic liberties, was actually much in the spirit of the classical liberal vision, because we have free trade in movement of capital, goods, persons, ideas. But the EU central institutions have not stopped to grow. Then in 1989, as I argue, in 1989, as I argue in my book, there came a very important incident, which was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then these new countries wanted to join, like Poland, Hungary, Czechia, and Slovakia, Romania, and so on. They wanted to join, and they were, of course, kind of tired of empires and socialism. So they would rather just want to have free trade, freedom. They wanted freedom. So they would come on the side of the supporters of the classical liberal vision. So actually, fear was on part of Mitterrand and socialist politicians that when these countries would join too quickly, that the European Union would, as they called it, degenerate into just a free trade zone, which is actually the ideal of the classical liberal vision, to have just a free trade zone. And so the socialists said, well, we don't want this to happen, so we have to include them very slowly in the European Union, and we have to move forward in the integration with a decisive step, which was an introduction of the common currency.
So I'm no stranger to controversy. I'm happy to say controversial things in our financial newsletters. I'm happy to work with Nigel Farage because of all that. But you made me laugh and surprised me when you compared the Treaty of Maastricht to the Treaty of Versailles. And that might sound a bit extreme, but you very carefully lay out the similarities between the two. And there's actually a similarity that I can tell you about, which makes you laugh, I'm sure. And that's my mum is German and I'm German, and my wife and the in-laws obviously are Japanese. And a few Christmases ago, we were sitting having dinner at my mum's house, and my mum said, "Well, you're all very lovely people, but why did you bomb Pearl Harbor?" And so that didn't go down so well, especially because my mum's German, and the rest of the history with World War II. So it's especially interesting to me because my father-in-law, Japanese father-in-law, answered that it was because of the petroleum reserves. And you mentioned the same thing when you compare the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Maastricht. So convince us of the similarities.
That is correct. The hunger blockade in the First World War was traumatic because the British, they blockaded the trade. So there was not enough food coming to Germany, and Germany at this point already was a country that was not feeding itself, but was importing food and producing manufactured goods and so on. So hundreds of thousands of people died due to this blockade, and actually they continued with it after the war was over, after the treaty was signed, in order to also impose the Treaty of Versailles, the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. So to have this pressure on Germany, that the Treaty of Versailles meant many injustices. For example, giving the whole blame for the war to outbreak of the war to Germany, and territories where majority of were German speakers or German nationality were given to other countries. So and it was one of the reasons why Hitler was elected, because he promised to get rid of the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles, and he also wanted Lebensraum in order to make Germany independent of the imports, to be able to feed autarky, to feed the population. So Bastiat said we need free trade for peace, because he said when goods do not cross borders, armies will. And this is the idea that Hitler said, well, if we cannot import it, if they block us, or if there's a war again, then we need the Lebensraum, we need to be able to feed ourselves and produce everything for ourselves. So this then produces obviously conflicts, while free trade, it means that you are in contact with other people, and you see that you need them, and you see also that they are nice people and that you profit from interacting. So this is a harmonious cooperation. While the euro is actually, that is not free trade. I mean, if it's free trade when Germans go on vacations to Greece, and in turn the Greeks buy German cars, this is free trade. But it's not free trade if the Greek government has a deficit. It's financed through the production of new euros, and the Greeks import German cars, and they are paying with debt which will never be being paid in real terms. Because this also creates conflicts. At the beginning, when the redistribution is hidden, not so much. But then in 2010, when the Greeks actually the Greek government needed a bailout, it became obvious to Germans that how is it possible, the Germans said, that they have a lower retiring age than we. They retire at, I don't know, 60 or 55, and they have paid vacations and a higher percentage of the last wage as a pension. How is it possible that we have to bail them out? No, so and then there were conflicts, and the Greeks also said, "How can you not bail us out? You occupied Greece in the Second World War and did not pay enough reparations or any reparations." So there was a conflict created, and this is always when you when you stop free trade, and the euro is a way to lead to or it implies unjust and involuntary redistribution, which is a source of potential conflict.
In the book, you call it expropriation, and that to me was the key. It's the opportunity of some countries in Europe, the less responsible ones, at least in terms of fiscal prudence, to expropriate wealth from the ones who are more responsible, and that leads to the divergence over time. Let's dig into the sort of a list of what's wrong with the euro, what consequences it causes. To me, that's one of the key parts of your book, to really understand why the euro is a problem just inherently.
Yeah, well, the one problem is it's the most important problem is that it's a tragedy of the commons. Yeah. And then another problem is that it's a fiat currency. Yeah, and I think these are the most important, and that there are no rules that are being adhered to. And today we have the very concrete problems of the euro. That is, the rules are not adhered to. We have a central bank that get ever more radicalized, that has been taken over totally by Southern European monetary policy. Yeah, I mean, it has been sold to Germans that the European Central Bank would be like an image or a copy of the Bundesbank. Therefore, it was installed in Frankfurt, and the first one was president was a Dutch. Then came a French, and the idea was after the French, okay, then it will be us. So then it will be a German in the Bundesbank tradition. Yeah, typical because they have Bundesbank has this very special ideology. When you talk to them, to the old Bundesbankers, they have really this special ideas, very monetarist, but okay, they want really preserve the purchasing power of the currency, which is the most important for them. Yeah. So then came the French, and then they proposed Axel Weber. Or he was going to be the next one, but he declined because he saw he would not have a majority in the ECB Council. Yeah, and then the chief economist, which I also have met twice, Jürgen Stark, he in being not in agreement with the decisions, he also declined. So the German influence was reduced even more. So after Trichet, then. When the German was going to come, well, they came in Italian, Mario Draghi. Yeah, and then we thought, okay, after Mario Draghi, then there will be a German, must be a German. I mean, it's the most important economy in the tradition of the Bundesbank, and there has been only French and Italians there. And Jens Weidmann was in the position, and he wanted this, but then there was made kind of a deal that van der Leyen was become the president of the EU Commission, and Christine Lagarde, Miss Lagarde, came from the IMF to be the president of the ECB. So I argue in my book that actually the idea, or what the French actually feared most, was the D-Mark. And I tell this one anecdote that is very illuminating. When the French in 1988 or the end of the 80s installed nuclear weapons at the German border that could short range, so they could only explode in Germany. And supposedly, if the Soviets would invade them, they would nuke the Germany. And the Germans said, "Well, this is something very uncomfortable. Even if the Soviets invade us, we don't want you to nuke us with nuclear weapons. Can we do something about it?" And the French replied, "Well, let's talk first about the German atomic bomb." And the Germans answered, "Well, we are not allowed to have chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons." And the French said, "Well, we mean the D-Mark." Yeah. So they saw it actually as a threat, like an economic power against them. And why? Because if the French government wanted to spend more, they wanted to have a deficit. If that would be financed by its central bank, the French franc would fall against the D-Mark if the D-Mark would be more stable, yeah, and because a more stable monetary policy, more sound. So the continuous fall of the franc was an indication to the French population that politicians were doing something wrongly, or worse than the Germans at least. So it was like a smoking gun that there was inflation going on, and they wanted to get rid of it, and they wanted to get control of the D-Mark. And I argue that the introduction of the euro was actually to eliminate this influence of the D-Mark and the Bundesbank, because before, if you have like fixed currency system as the European system was, if you want to maintain stable rates, you cannot inflate more than the country that inflates less, yeah, which was typically Germany. So you would have to orientate yourself on the monetary policy of Germany. Otherwise, you would have to devalue, your currency would depreciate. And this happens with the Dutch, for example. When the Dutch meeting was typically, the Germans just raised interest rates. Okay, we do the same. Yeah, so you have to do the same. So there was basically monetary policy hegemony of German hegemony in Europe, and they wanted to get rid of it. And that's what I argue. And I think what has happened is pretty clear. They have been totally successful. They have had Trichet, Draghi, Italian monetary policy, and French policy with Lagarde again. The Bundesbank influence has been totally reduced. So it has been, in this respect, it has been a complete success. I mean, what the European Central Bank is now doing has no remembrance or similarity to what typically Bundesbank monetary policy would be. Yeah.
What mystifies me about that, or what I think is really important to point out, is that the European elites created the problem in the first place that you've just described by having the exchange rate mechanism. So by trying to peg currencies to each other, they were forced to stick with the German monetary policy hegemony. So they created a problem, created a solution to it that created a new problem, and then it just cycles through like that. And the euro and the current situation with the sovereign debt crisis that resulted is just this cascade of problems that came from trying to peg exchange rates in the exchange rate mechanism. What about housing bubbles, though? To me, that's one of the key problems that the euro has created, or did create, and is currently actually creating in Germany, correct?
Yeah, that is totally correct. I mean, they started with the expansionary monetary policy, or extraordinary expansionary monetary policy, with the sovereign debt crisis. And where has all this money gone? I mean, there has been not much price inflation. It has been asset inflation, so stocks and real estate. I mean, Germany did not have the bubbles in the early 2000s like Greek, Italy, Spain, and France. And actually, housing prices were kind of moderate up to 2008, 2010. I would actually say somewhat cheap. And of course, where did the new money go? Well, first there, and then the prices came to a more realistic level, and then it totally went into bubble territory. And now it's almost impossible to buy, for a family to buy a space in big cities like Munich or Berlin. Yeah, and it was fueled also due to the fear of a collapse of the euro. That is, many Greeks or Italians, they bought actually property in Germany, in Munich or Berlin, because they thought if Italy leaves, or Greece leaves the euro, then our new currency will depreciate maybe 20-30%. So we will be 20 or 30% more poor, respective for the other countries, the countries that remain in the euro. But if we buy property within the Eurozone, but will remain the Eurozone, or in Germany, then we will protect our property. So this huge real estate bubble is of course a problem, because when it bursts, there will be defaults on debts and loans and losses for banks, and banks are of course not in a good position. I mean, the banking system would be another big problem of the euro or the Eurozone, because it's full of bad loans, non-performing loans. It's full also of with government debts. And as Draghi said, we will do anything to save the euro. And what they did was to ruin also the profitability of the banking system. So he basically saved the euro on cost of the banks, because the traditional business model is to the maturity transformation. So they endebt themselves short term and they lend long term at higher rates. Yeah, but this extraordinary monetary policy has brought interest rates down so much that the spread has been reduced. Yeah, and I mean, the banks could just before 2012 or 2010, banks' business model or one source of income would just, people would deposit money in the banks, would not receive no interest, and banks would just lend it on the interbank market for 1 or 2% the money overnight. So very safe profit. Yeah, that is called the passive margin. That is because passive, you basically only overnight, almost no risk. And the passive, you see the passive margin that was 1% overnight. How is it now? It's now negative. It's now negative because if banks loan through the interbank market, yeah, Euribor is negative, so they lose money. They lose money, and the same is with maturity transformation over the long run. When 10 or 15 years ago, they would receive money for short-term money at 1 or 2%, and they would lend it out at a mortgage at 7% or 6%, whatever. But there's still 5% margin. What is the margin now? Well, now they get money at zero. Okay, they get money in at basically zero. But if they lend it in a mortgage of 30 years, they get only 2%. So a little bit more, but you see that the margin has been reduced, and it is being reduced ever more because they still have in their portfolios, they have the old loans at 30 years, but ever less so. And the new ones that they are renewing them, putting out new ones, they have a lower. So the profit margin has been reduced tremendously by the ECB policy. And therefore, the European banking system is in such a bad state.
So let's turn to what you think happens next. You've mentioned a lot of names in this discussion, like Mario Draghi and Lagarde, and it seems to me that the same people who caused the problem are now in charge of trying to fix it. Do you think they're going to succeed?
No, because I think what they have in mind, what they think is good, is to have an Italian monetary policy for all Europe, what they are having now. And the idea is or the function of the central bank is to help to finance the government. And they think also, I mean, there was just a joint letter signed by George Soros and leftist activists and think tanks saying that we need basically three things. They say, and this is what these people think. They say we need a common permanent European budget, EU budget, financed through debt. We need to get rid of the stupid rules because of the Stability and Growth Pact, because this reduces government spending. What we need now is the government spend, so we get out of the Corona crisis. We make the green transformation into a green economy and digital transformation and lift millions out of poverty. They actually say so. Yeah, we need the state to lift millions out of poverty, as if the state would reduce poverty and create wealth. No, so for them, it's basically the stupid rules that inhibit the good guy, which is the state, to produce heaven on earth. So this is, and of course, George Soros they're also signing it. And the third thing is that they want the ECB to finance all this. They say, well, the ECB has to continue with its monetary policy to finance the debts of the EU and the higher debts of the individual countries. So this is what they think. So they think this is the solution: more state, more government expenditures, and all financed through monetary policy. So if you have this ideology, you cannot solve the problem. Yeah.
Why doesn't the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the German constitutional court, stop all this?
That's a very good question. Actually, I just signed today a letter where I'm joining a new case against or saying that it's unconstitutional, this common debts that they instituted now in the Corona crisis, because the EU treaty says there will be no common debt, that we are guaranteed by all. So why not? Yeah, supposedly they are always, yeah, I guess they don't want to have to, they don't want to have the responsibility to blow the whole thing up. They put like some limits always, but then these limits can all on the ECB policy, but they can be interpreted. And curiously, later on, the ECB clearly oversteps the limits, but then they say, "Oh no, we are not responsible. It has to go to the European Central Court." So yeah, I'm not, or maybe the wrong people are sitting as judges there. I'm not sure. I think they don't want to be responsible to blow the whole thing up. At least not the sole only responsible for that.
You think we're that close that the right sort of ruling from the German Constitutional Court really could blow up the euro?
Yeah, I mean, if they would have decided in the cases they had before that it would be unconstitutional to have the permanent bailout fund, or to that the ECB would buy sovereign bonds directly on the secondary market, then the party would be over. I think it would have been over.
I don't know whether to describe it as blowing up or an implosion. Philip Douglas, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, you're very, very, very welcome, Nick. It was a pleasure.